The church bell tolled 7 times as Elias plunged into the icy waters of the Columbia River, cradling a child everyone had given up for lost, while the symbols etched into the ancient artifact gleamed like embers on the bank, finally free from the chains that had bound them for decades. 3 weeks prior to that moment of redemption, autumn painted the Oregon leaves in golden hues mirrored in the river's calm surface. Elias woke at 5, as he had every morning since returning from the war in Afghanistan 5 years prior. His morning ritual was sacred: black coffee, untoasted bread, and the walk to the Columbia Riverbank, where he fished before the world awoke and the river lost its serenity. That particular morning, an unusual mist hung over the water, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to dance among the reeds. Elias noticed it but didn't give it much thought. He was used to the vagaries of the Pacific Northwest weather. He carried his worn fishing tackle box and the bamboo rod that had belonged to his grandfather, a Portuguese immigrant who had arrived in this land as a young man, bringing only sea stories and an unwavering faith in the goodness of the waters. The veteran chose his usual spot, near the bend where the river formed a small cove sheltered by willows. This is where he caught the best fish, away from the tourists and Sunday anglers who crowded the more accessible banks. As he prepared his bait, his eye was caught by something half buried in the mud where the current had deposited branches and debris from recent rains. At first glance, it looked like just another log, but something about its shape didn't fit the organic patterns of nature. Elias approached, carefully stepping on the slippery stones. The object was partially metallic, covered in a greenish patina that spoke of decades submerged. More intriguing were the rusty chains encircling it, not randomly, but deliberately, as if someone had tried to keep it imprisoned at the bottom of the river. Attached to the chains were small strips of tanned leather swaying in the current like dried leaves. As Elias bent down to examine them closer, he realized they contained engraved symbols. They didn't look Native American, nor European. They were something different, older, more unsettling. It was when he touched it that everything changed. The chill that shot up his arms didn't come from the icy water, but from something deeper, more primal. His ears filled with a dull pressure, as if he were diving into deep waters. And then came the visions. Quick, fragmented flashes, like pieces of an old movie projected at high speed. A cabin in flames. A dark-haired woman screaming a name he couldn't decipher. A child, boy or girl, he couldn't tell, falling into dark water, arms flailing desperately before disappearing beneath the surface. And lastly, clearer than the others, the face of a man with crazed eyes, muttering something in a language Elias didn't recognize. As he sank that same object into the waters of the Columbia, the veteran pulled his hand back, as if he had touched a hot coal. His heart pounded erratically, and he had to sit on a nearby rock to regain his balance. During the war, he had faced situations that tested the limits of his sanity, but nothing compared to the disturbing clarity of these images. They weren't dreams or hallucinations, they were memories, but not his. For a long moment, Elias contemplated the artifact, torn between the urge to abandon it and a growing curiosity that seemed to come from a deep place in his soul. There was something familiar about those visions, something that resonated with the sleepless nights he'd spent since the war, when the ghosts of the past visited his dreams. Perhaps that's why he felt compelled to understand what was happening. He decided to try removing it from the mud. The object resisted more than it should have for something its size. It was as if the river itself was reluctant to release it, as if the waters knew that some secrets should remain buried. Elias had to use a sturdy branch as a lever, and all the strength his age-stiffened muscles could muster. When it finally gave way, it was accompanied by a cloud of dark mud that turned the water murky for several feet around. Free from the chains, the artifact revealed its true nature. It was a metal box, no larger than a thick book, covered in engraved symbols that extended across its entire surface. The chains weren't just wrapped around it, they were welded to the metal, as if they had been forged with the object. The leather strips contained more symbols, some repeating those on the box, others completely different, forming patterns that suggested some kind of ritual or enchantment. Elias carried his discovery home, a small wooden cabin he rented near the river, far enough from town to guarantee the solitude his wounded soul needed. There, under the kitchen lamplight, he examined the object more carefully. The symbols seemed to shift with the angle of the light, creating shadows that suggested impossible shapes. There was something hypnotic about those patterns, something that made him lose track of time. It was only when the rising sun began to filter through the curtains that Elias realized he had spent the entire night contemplating the box, and that's when he noticed the first change. Outside, the birds had begun their morning chorus, but something was wrong. It wasn't the usual sounds, joyful, varied, full of life. It was a repetitive pattern, as if all the birds were singing the same melody. Elias went outside to check and found dozens of crows perched on the branches around his cabin, all facing his house, all in absolute silence, just watching. When he appeared on the porch, the crows took flight simultaneously, creating a black cloud that momentarily blotted out the rising sun. Then, everything returned to normal. The common birds resumed their songs. The wind rustled the leaves naturally, as if nothing had happened. But Elias knew something had changed. He could feel it in his bones, the same intuition that had kept him alive during the fighting in the Middle East. He had awakened something that should have remained dormant. The following days brought a series of events that, taken individually, could be explained as coincidences, but together, they formed a pattern that left Elias increasingly uneasy. First were the animals. Martha Henderson, who ran the only convenience store in the small town of Riverbank, mentioned that her cats had become agitated, refusing to go near the windows overlooking the river. The neighborhood dogs howled every night between 2 and 3 in the morning, always in the same direction, the stretch of the Columbia River, where Elias had found the artifact. Then came the dreams. During his weekly visit to the small market, Elias overheard fragmented conversations that chilled him to the bone. Beth Morrison, the librarian, was talking to another woman about a recurring nightmare, a dark-haired woman screaming for help in a burning cabin. The Presbyterian church pastor, Reverend Collins, confided to a parishioner that he had been having visions of a child drowning, always the same child, always in the same dark and deep place. These were the same images Elias had experienced upon touching the artifact, but now they seemed to be spreading through the community like a silent infection. The most disturbing aspect, however, was the behavior of the river itself. Jerry Thompson, who had run the city's sanitation department for over 20 years, reported something that defied any rational explanation. Logs and debris were being carried upstream, against the natural flow of the water. Local authorities attributed the phenomenon to changes in atmospheric pressure or some temporary disturbance in the current, but Jerry knew that didn't make sense. In 2 decades working on the banks of the Columbia, he had never witnessed anything like it. It was during his 3rd night with the artifact at home that Elias understood he could no longer postpone a decision. The visions were becoming more intense, more vivid. Now he saw not just fragments, but entire sequences. The dark-haired woman had a name, Sarah. The child was a boy, no older than 8, and his name was Benjamin. The man with crazed eyes was Marcus, Sarah's husband, and there was something deeply wrong with his mind. In the most recent visions, Elias saw Marcus discovering what appeared to be an ancestral ritual, something found in ancient books or forgotten manuscripts. There was a growing obsession with power, with control over forces he didn't understand. The burning cabin was the result of an experiment gone wrong. Sarah had died trying to save Benjamin, who in turn had drowned in the river when he tried to escape the flames. But the most disturbing thing was discovering that Marcus had survived, and that, consumed by remorse and madness, he had tried to seal what he had done, imprisoning the artifact, which he had realized was the source of his powers and his misfortune, at the bottom of the Columbia. The currents were not just physical, they were a spiritual link, holding captive not only the object, but the spirits of those who had suffered because of it. Elias realized that by removing the artifact from the river, he had freed something that Marcus had tried to contain. The visions were not random memories, they were cries for help. Sarah and Benjamin were still bound to that object, and their growing agitation was affecting the entire community. On the morning of the fourth day, Elias made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to return the artifact to the river or handing it over to the authorities, he decided to seek answers. If there was a way to seal that force, there must also be a way to release it properly. His first stop was the Riverbank Library, where Beth Morrison managed a modest collection of local books and historical documents. Beth was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but kind eyes that revealed a curious intelligence and a willingness to help. Elias, she greeted him when he entered the library that morning. What a surprise to see you here. Are you looking for something specific? Information about the region's history, he replied, trying to sound casual, especially about families who lived near the river in the past decades. Beth smiled, clearly pleased to have an interesting project. You've come to the right place. We have an entire section dedicated to local history, including property records, old obituaries, and some family genealogies that older residents have donated over the years. She led him to a small but well-organized section in the back of the library. Any specific period? Elias hesitated. How to explain that he was looking for information about events he had witnessed in visions, maybe between 1960 and 1980. I'm interested in families who may have lived near the riverbend, where I usually fish. Oh, that area has an interesting history, Beth commented, pulling some volumes from the shelves. There was a period when several properties there changed hands quickly. Some people said the land was problematic. She paused, as if considering whether she should continue. Actually, there was a tragic incident in the late 1970s. A family, let me see if I can find the records. While Beth searched the archives, Elias felt his heart quicken. The pieces were falling into place, but a part of him dreaded what he would discover. Here it is, Beth said finally, placing a yellowed file on the table. The Marcus family, Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin. They lived in a cabin by the river between 1975 and 1978. There was a fire. Sarah and Benjamin died. Marcus disappeared. They never found his body. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents. There were photographs that exactly matched the people from his visions. Sarah, with her dark hair and gentle smile. Benjamin, an 8-year-old boy with curious eyes and a chipped front tooth. And Marcus, who in the official photos looked unremarkable, but whose gaze already held something unsettling, an intensity that didn't belong on that ordinary face. Is there anything more about Marcus? Elias asked. About what he did, his interests. Beth consulted her notes. According to his neighbors at the time, he was eccentric. He spent a lot of time studying books on local history, especially about the indigenous tribes who lived in the area before European settlers. Some people mentioned he had a particular obsession with ancient rituals and spiritual practices. A chill ran down Elias's spine. Rituals. Apparently, he believed certain objects and places held spiritual power. There were rumors that he was trying to communicate with forces he didn't understand. Beth lowered her voice, as if sharing a secret. Of course, that's all speculation, but after the fire, several people reported strange experiences in the area. Vivid dreams, unusual animal behavior, inexplicable changes in the river's flow. The pattern was becoming crystal clear. Marcus had discovered or created something powerful, something that connected the physical world to spiritual dimensions. His obsession had cost his family their lives, and apparently, his own sanity. The artifact was both a conduit and a prison, channeling spiritual energies, but also trapping those who had been affected by its power. Beth, Elias said carefully, you mentioned people reported strange experiences. Is that still happening? She looked at him curiously. Why do you ask? Have you noticed anything unusual? Elias decided to be partially honest. Maybe. Some strange animal behavior, people commenting on vivid dreams. I was curious if there was a historical pattern. Beth nodded thoughtfully. Every now and then, there are bursts of activity. Every few years for a couple of weeks, people report phenomena similar to those in 1978. Then everything goes back to normal, as if something goes back to sleep. This confirmed Elias's suspicion. The artifact exerted its influence periodically, perhaps when spiritual or environmental conditions were right, but its removal from the river had created a different, more intense situation. Without the currents that kept it submerged, its energy was spreading freely through the community. That night, Elias returned to his cabin with a clearer understanding of his situation, but also with a heavy responsibility. It wasn't just a matter of returning the artifact to the river that would only restart the cycle. He needed to find a way to free Sarah and Benjamin, allowing their souls to find peace, and at the same time neutralize the object's power so it could no longer cause suffering. Sitting at the kitchen table, contemplating the artifact under the lamplight, Elias reflected on his own journey. The war had taught him about loss, about guilt, about carrying the weight of decisions that affect other lives. He had returned from Afghanistan, wounded not only physically, but spiritually, carrying the ghosts of comrades he hadn't been able to save, and civilians he had been forced to abandon. Perhaps that was why the trapped souls in that artifact had found him a recipient. They recognized in Elias someone who understood loss, someone who carried his own spiritual prisons. Sarah, he murmured to the silent object. Benjamin, I understand you need help, but I need to know how to help you. The visions that came that night were different from the previous ones. Instead of fragmented flashes of terror and death, Elias saw moments of life. Sarah singing Benjamin to sleep, Marcus in the early days of his marriage, when he was still kind and loving, the family having picnics by the river on summer Sundays. But there were also instructions, as if Sarah were trying to communicate something specific, images of a particular location on the river, not where Elias had found the artifact, but a few miles upstream, where the waters were deeper and calmer. There was something special about that place, a rock formation that formed a natural pattern, an area where moonlight reflected in a particular way. Elias woke with the certainty that Sarah was trying to show him where some kind of liberation ritual should take place, but he still didn't know exactly what to do when he got there. The answer came from an unexpected source. The next morning, while Elias was having coffee at the small-town diner, a habit he had developed to maintain some contact with the community, he was approached by an elderly woman he didn't recognize immediately. She was small and stooped with age, her white hair tucked into a colorful scarf, and eyes that, despite her advanced age, shone with intelligence and determination. "You're the man who lives in the cabin by the river bend," she said without preamble, sitting down across from him, without waiting for an invitation. Elias nodded cautiously. "I am, and you are." "Margaret Crow Feather," she replied, and Elias immediately noted the implied indigenous origin in the name. "My great-grandmother was from the Kalapuya tribe that lived on this land before the settlers. Some traditions are preserved in the family, including sensitivity to spiritual disturbances." Elias felt his pulse quicken. Disturbances. Margaret smiled, a smile that carried decades of wisdom and experience. "Young man, I can feel the weight you carry, not just from your war, but something more recent, something you found near the river." There was no point in denying it. If Margaret truly possessed spiritual sensitivity, she already knew far more than he could hide. "How do you know?" "Animals talk to those who know how to listen. The winds carry messages to those who have ears to hear them, and certain lost souls cry out so loudly that it's impossible to ignore them." Margaret leaned forward. "You found Marcus's box." Elias felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Finally, someone who understood the situation without him needing to explain or prove anything. "You know about Marcus. My great-grandmother told me stories about white men trying to steal powers that weren't theirs. Marcus was one of them. He found sacred artifacts, ancient texts, tried to use knowledge that took generations of shamans to understand. The result was predictable: destruction, death, souls trapped between worlds. Can you help them? Sarah and Benjamin. Margaret studied his face for a long moment. I can, but not alone. Spiritual liberation requires two elements: ancestral knowledge and a pure heart. I have the former, but my age and my own burden of years prevent me from channeling the necessary energy. You have the latter, a heart that knows loss, but hasn't been hardened by bitterness. She paused, letting the words sink into Elias's mind. The question is, are you willing to risk your own spiritual peace to free the souls of strangers? Elias didn't hesitate. For years, he had searched for a way to give meaning to the suffering he carried from the war. Perhaps this was the opportunity he had unconsciously been seeking. I am. Margaret smiled again, this time with approval. Then we will meet tonight, under the full moon, at the place Sarah has been trying to show you. Bring the artifact, but also bring courage. What we will do will require you to confront not only the sufferings of Sarah and Benjamin, but also your own. For those who have been following these stories of mystery and human resilience, it's worth subscribing to the channel to continue receiving reports like this, exploring the territories where the inexplicable meets human compassion. That night, under the silvery light of the full moon, Elias and Margaret met at the place that had appeared in the visions. It was exactly as Sarah had shown, a stretch of the river where the waters were deeper and calmer, surrounded by a natural configuration of rocks that formed almost a perfect circle. The moonlight reflected on the water's surface, creating patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Margaret had brought several items: dried herbs, small crystals that glowed softly in the darkness, and a leather drum that had belonged to her great-grandmother. The objects are merely tools, she explained as she arranged everything in a specific pattern around the circle of rocks. The true power comes from intention, compassion, the genuine will to help. Elias placed the artifact in the center of the circle. Immediately, the symbols engraved on its surface began to emit a faint light, like embers covered in ashes. The temperature around them dropped several degrees, and Elias could see his own breath forming clouds of vapor in the night air. They are here, Margaret murmured, beginning to beat the drum in a slow hypnotic rhythm. Sarah, Benjamin, they can feel our presence. The visions that followed were unlike any before. Instead of chaotic fragments, Elias experienced the complete story, as if he were living the events firsthand. He saw Marcus as he had been before the obsession consumed him, a kind man, a history teacher at a local school, fascinated by the indigenous cultures of the region. His research had begun innocently, driven by academic curiosity and respect for ancestral traditions, but gradually, as he uncovered ancient texts and artifacts, his motivation shifted from understanding to possession. The artifact Elias held had been discovered by Marcus in an unauthorized excavation on sacred land. It was an object of real power, created by ancestral shamans to facilitate communication with the spirit world. But its use required not only technical knowledge, but purity of intention and years of spiritual preparation, elements Marcus lacked. His first experiences seemed successful. He could contact spirits, receive visions of distant events, even seemed able to influence the behavior of animals and local weather conditions. Sarah, initially skeptical, began to believe when she saw undeniable evidence of her husband's growing powers. But power without wisdom is always dangerous. Marcus became addicted to the energies he could channel, increasingly reckless in his experiments. He began attempting more complex rituals, invoking forces he didn't understand. The house filled with a dark energy that affected the whole family. Benjamin began having nightmares. Sarah developed constant anxiety. Animals refused to approach the property. The final tragedy occurred when Marcus attempted a ritual of transcendence, believing he could use the artifact to elevate his family to a higher spiritual state. What he achieved, instead, was opening a portal between dimensions, unleashing energies he couldn't control. The ensuing fire wasn't accidental. It was the result of the collision between spiritual forces and the physical world. Sarah died trying to protect Benjamin from the fire and the entities Marcus had inadvertently invoked. Benjamin drowned in the river when he tried to escape, but his soul became trapped in the artifact at the moment of his death, as did Sarah's. Marcus, consumed by horror and guilt, tried to undo what he had done. He forged spiritual chains around the artifact and threw it into the river, believing the flowing water could disperse its energy. In part, it worked. The object became contained at the bottom of the Columbia River, and the souls of Sarah and Benjamin entered a kind of spiritual hibernation. But they weren't free. They remained trapped, waiting for someone who could properly complete the liberation ritual that Marcus had attempted but failed to perform. "Now you understand," said Margaret, her voice blending with the sound of the drum and the murmur of the water. "Sarah and Benjamin aren't dead in the traditional sense, but they aren't alive either. They exist in an intermediate state, conscious but unable to move on. To free them, you must assume the role Marcus should have played, be the bridge between worlds, allow their souls to find their way to peace." Elias felt the weight of responsibility, but also a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. During the war, he'd felt powerless in the face of the suffering around him. Here, finally, was something he could do, a real difference he could make. How? You must be willing to temporarily carry their pain, to experience their deaths as if they were your own, and then consciously release those experiences, allowing the souls to follow their natural course. It's a dangerous process. Some who have tried have become trapped in the same limbo they intended to dissolve. Elias looked at the artifact, whose symbols now glowed intensely, responding to the proximity of the spirits it housed. He could feel Sarah and Benjamin, their presences as real as Margaret's beside him. They were waiting, trusting him to do what no one else had been able to. "I'm ready." What followed was the most intense experience of Elias's life. Margaret intensified the rhythm of the drum, and the world around them began to fade. Elias felt himself being pulled into the artifact, into the liminal space where Sarah and Benjamin had been trapped for decades. First, he experienced Sarah's death, the terror of watching the flames spread through the house, the desperate determination to protect her son, the physical agony of the burns, and finally, the moment of transition when her soul disconnected from her injured body. But instead of moving on to whatever came next, she had been sucked into the artifact, trapped by the uncontrolled energy Marcus had unleashed. Then came Benjamin's turn, the confusion of a child who didn't understand what was happening, the panic at seeing his mother injured, the desperate dash to the river in an attempt to escape the flames, and then the cold water engulfing his small body, filling his lungs, until everything went dark. His soul too had been captured at the moment of death, joining his mother's in the spiritual prison the artifact had become. For moments that felt like eternity, Elias carried the combined weight of both deaths, the accumulated pain of decades of spiritual confinement, the despair of souls who knew they were dead, but couldn't accept or transcend that state. It was an agony that went beyond the physical. It was the purest form of existential suffering. But then, gradually, Elias began to understand something fundamental. Sarah and Benjamin's imprisonment wasn't just a result of Marcus's uncontrolled magic. It was also a product of their own refusal to accept death. Sarah couldn't let go of Benjamin, and Benjamin couldn't leave his mother. It was the exact same pattern Elias recognized in himself. The ghosts he carried from the war weren't just traumatic memories. They were his refusal to accept that he couldn't have saved everyone, that some losses were inevitable, that carrying eternal guilt didn't honor the dead, it only imprisoned the living. The river continued its eternal course, carrying with it stories of loss and renewal, of buried secrets and revealed truths. But for Elias, the waters no longer whispered of ghosts from the past, they sang of future possibilities, of the infinite capacity of the human heart to heal, grow, and find meaning even in the most painful experiences. And every morning, as he went out fishing at the first ray of sunlight, Elias carried with him not the weight of the dead, but the sacred responsibility of the living, to honor those he lost by living fully, to transform experience into wisdom, and to always be ready to extend a saving hand when life's waters became too turbulent for someone to navigate alone. The church bell continued its 7 morning chimes, but now they didn't just mark the passage of time, they celebrated each new day as an opportunity for redemption, each sunrise as a chance to make a difference in someone's life, each moment as a precious gift honoring both the living and those who had departed to calmer, more serene waters. In the end, Elias understood that the true mystery hadn't been the artifact or its supernatural powers. The mystery lay in the human capacity to transform suffering into compassion, isolation into community, and despair into hope. It was a mystery that didn't need to be solved, only lived, day after day, in a succession of small acts of kindness that together formed a life of meaning and purpose. And in the calm waters of the Columbia River, reflecting the infinite sky above, that truth continued to flow, eternal and renewing, carrying with it the promise that every lost soul can find its way back home.